Welcome to today's episode. Imagine standing on a vast windswept plain that stretches as far as you can see. The air is bitterly cold, biting at your exposed skin. Around you, mammoths trumpet in the distance, their massive forms silhouetted against an endless horizon. This isn't science fiction. This is Beringia, 30,000 years ago, and you're witnessing one of humanity's greatest journeys. For over a century, scientists have wrestled with one of archaeology's most captivating mysteries. How did humans first reach the Americas? When did they arrive? And perhaps most intriguingly, why did they leave everything familiar behind to venture into the unknown? The answers to these questions have been rewritten time and again, each new discovery forcing us to reconsider what we thought we knew about our ancestors. You might have learned in school that the first Americans walked across a land bridge from Asia during the last ice age. That story seems simple, neat, and satisfying. But like many simple stories, it was incomplete. Recent discoveries have shattered our understanding, revealing a far more complex, dramatic, and fascinating tale. We now know that the peopling of the Americas involved multiple migrations, different routes, sophisticated maritime technology, and timing that challenges everything we once believed. This isn't just ancient history. The story of how humans reached the Americas tells us something profound about who we are as a species. It reveals our capacity for adaptation, our courage in facing the unknown, and our ability to thrive in the harshest environments imaginable. These weren't random wanderers stumbling onto a new continent. They were skilled hunter-gatherers, maritime explorers, and pioneers who changed the world forever. Today, we're going to unravel this mystery, piece by piece, discovery by discovery, until you understand how the impossible became reality. Chapter 1. The Frozen Gateway. You're standing at the edge of the world as Ice Age humans knew it. Behind you lies the vast expanse of Siberia. Ahead stretches an endless frozen plain disappearing into mist and mystery. This is Beringia, and it's nothing like you might imagine. Forget the narrow strip of land you might picture when someone says, land bridge. Beringia was a subcontinent, a massive territory that connected Asia to North America, stretching up to 1,000 kilometers wide at its greatest extent. To put that in perspective, imagine an area roughly the size of British Columbia and Alberta combined, now completely submerged beneath the Bering Strait. The formation of Beringia reads like a geological thriller. During the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 19,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The planet's climate cooled dramatically, and massive ice sheets began to form across the northern hemisphere. These weren't just big glaciers. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada and extended down into what is now the northern United States. The Cordilleran ice sheet blanketed the western mountains. Together, these ice sheets locked up so much of Earth's water that global sea levels dropped by 60 to 120 meters compared to today. That's equivalent to a 40-story building. As the oceans receded, the shallow continental shelf between Siberia and Alaska emerged from the waves. The Bering Strait, which today averages only 50 meters deep, became dry land. But here's what makes recent discoveries so revolutionary. For decades, scientists believed Beringia formed relatively early in the Ice Age, around 28,000 years ago. New research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences turned that timeline upside down. By analyzing sediments from the Arctic ocean floor, researchers discovered that Beringia didn't fully emerge until approximately 36,000 years ago, much later than previously thought. This finding dramatically shortens the window of time available for human migration and raises profound questions about the timing and nature of that journey. What was Beringia actually like? Close your eyes and picture not a barren wasteland, but a unique ecosystem unlike anything that exists today. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, a vast grassland dominated by sedges, grasses, and low shrubs. This environment supported one of the richest concentrations of large mammals Earth has ever seen. Woolly mammoths grazed in massive herds, their curved tusks sweeping aside snow to reach vegetation beneath. Steppe bison, larger than their modern descendants, moved across the plains in thousands. The cabalid horses that roamed Beringia bore little resemblance to modern horses. They were stocky, powerful animals perfectly adapted to the cold. Predators prowled everywhere. Giant short-faced bears stood over 14 feet tall on their hind legs. Saber-toothed cats stalked the herds. Dire wolves hunted in packs. But Beringia wasn't uniformly hospitable. Recent analysis of Chukotka on Beringia's Siberian edge revealed that from about 57,000 to 15,000 years ago, the environment was wetter and colder than the surrounding steppe tundra. This region might have acted as a temporary barrier, creating what scientists call the Beringian Gap hypothesis. Certain species couldn't cross this zone. The woolly rhinoceros, for instance, never made it past the Anadyr River. Similarly, some North American megafauna, like the American badger, and certain horse species remain confined to the eastern side. This selective permeability suggests that Beringia wasn't a simple highway but a complex landscape with ecological barriers and corridors. Here's where human ingenuity enters the picture. Small groups of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers from northeastern Asia began moving into Beringia. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing disaster. Evidence suggests they were highly skilled people who had already adapted to life in some of Earth's harshest environments. They knew how to hunt large mammals, create sophisticated tools, and survive temperatures that would kill unprepared modern humans within hours. Genetic studies indicate that ancestral Native American populations diverged from Asian populations approximately 36,000 years ago, right around the time Beringia emerged. This timing is remarkable. It suggests that as soon as this land bridge opened, humans recognized the opportunity and seized it. But why would anyone venture into such an environment? The answer reveals something profound about human psychology and adaptation. Following game animals represented not just survival but opportunity. The megafauna of Beringia had never encountered human hunters. They lacked the wariness that animals in Africa and Asia had developed over hundreds of thousands of years of coexistence with our species. For skilled hunters, this represented an unprecedented bonanza. Mammoth hunting wasn't just about meat. A single mammoth provided food that could sustain a small group for months. The hide could be used for shelter and clothing. Bones became tools and building materials. Ivory had numerous applications. In archaeological sites across Siberia and Alaska, we find evidence of mammoth bone dwellings, structures created entirely from the remains of these giants. Recent discoveries have added another intriguing dimension to our understanding of early Beringian life. Analyses of biomarkers and microfossils preserved in sediments from northern Alaska lakes suggest that early humans burned Beringian landscapes as early as 34,000 years ago. This isn't evidence of accidental fires. The pattern suggests deliberate landscape management, using fire as a hunting tool. By creating controlled burns, these hunter-gatherers could drive megafauna toward ambush sites or create clearings that attracted grazing animals to specific locations. This represents sophisticated ecological knowledge and planning that contradicts simplistic notions of primitive cave dwellers. The Beringian population wasn't large. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that only a few thousand people at most lived in this vast territory. They formed what scientists call a source population, small groups that would eventually give rise to all the diverse indigenous peoples of the Americas. Think about that for a moment. Every Native American culture, from the Inuit of the Arctic to the Mapuche of southern Chile, from the Haudenosaunee of the eastern woodlands to the Chumash of California, all trace their ancestry back to these few thousand pioneers living in Beringia during the Ice Age. That's an extraordinary legacy. Life in Beringia required constant adaptation. The climate wasn't stable. Temperature fluctuations could be extreme. Food availability varied seasonally and annually. These early Beringians had to develop sophisticated survival strategies. Evidence from archaeological sites shows they created tailored clothing from animal skins, complete with bone needles for sewing. They built substantial shelters that could withstand brutal winters. They developed food preservation techniques, likely including freezing and drying meat. They created complex stone tools, showing clear technological traditions that would later diversify in the Americas. Most remarkably, they maintained their culture and technology over thousands of years, passing knowledge from generation to generation, even in the most challenging circumstances. As we piece together this picture of Beringia, we begin to understand that it wasn't merely a path but a homeland. People didn't just cross Beringia in a quick migration. They lived there, thrived there, and adapted to become a distinct population. Genetic studies reveal that Native Americans carry unique genetic variations that arose specifically during this Beringian period. These people weren't simply Asians who happened to wander to America. They were Beringians, a population that emerged from Asian ancestry but developed its own genetic and cultural identity during thousands of years of isolation on this now vanished land. This frozen gateway wasn't just a crossing point. It was a crucible where the ancestors of all Native Americans were forged. Chapter 2. A World Beneath the Waves. Imagine trying to solve a mystery when most of the evidence lies buried under hundreds of feet of seawater. This is the challenge facing archaeologists studying the earliest American migrations. The coastlines where ancient peoples may have lived and traveled are now submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean, drowned by rising seas as the Ice Age ended. You're looking at a crime scene where the ocean has stolen most of the clues. When the Ice Age was at its peak, global sea levels stood approximately 120 meters lower than today. That single fact transforms our understanding of geography and human migration routes. The Pacific coastline of North America looked radically different. Areas that are now deep underwater were dry land, beaches, and coastal forests. The continental shelf, that relatively shallow underwater platform extending from the continents, was exposed for thousands of square kilometers. Imagine standing on what is now California's Channel Islands. During the Ice Age, these weren't islands at all, but coastal hills overlooking a much more extensive landmass. Recent geological reconstructions have revealed something extraordinary about the shape of this ancient coastline. When sea levels began rising during deglaciation, around 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, the flooding created an incredibly convoluted and island-rich landscape along Beringia's southern shore. Picture an environment similar to coastal British Columbia or southeastern Alaska today, but magnified. Thousands of islands, protected channels, and sheltered bays emerged as the rising ocean carved up the landscape. For maritime-adapted peoples, this represented ideal territory, offering both protection from open ocean conditions and abundant resources. The ocean itself tells us stories through its sediments. Scientists drilling cores from the Gulf of Alaska seafloor have reconstructed ancient oceanographic conditions with remarkable precision. Their findings paint a vivid picture of what early coastal migrants would have encountered. During the last glacial maximum, through about 14,800 years ago, seasonal sea ice fringed the Gulf of Alaska. This wasn't permanent ice like the glaciers covering the land. It formed each winter and broke up each summer, creating a dynamic environment that would have required sophisticated adaptation strategies. Some researchers have even proposed a sea ice highway hypothesis, suggesting that winter sea ice provided a platform for hunting marine mammals and traveling between coastal locations, that the ocean offered far more than just ice. Along the North Pacific Rim, from Japan through the Aleutians to California and beyond, one ecosystem dominated: kelp forests. If you've never seen a kelp forest, imagine underwater cathedrals of vegetation, Giant kelp can grow more than 60 meters long, creating three-dimensional structures that rise from the seafloor to the surface. These forests rank among the most productive habitats on Earth, with primary productivity rates that rival tropical rainforests. More importantly for ancient migrants, kelp forests support an extraordinary diversity of marine life. Let me paint you a picture of what a kelp forest ecosystem provided. Shellfish of every description clung to rocks and kelp holdfasts. Mussels, abalone, sea urchins, and countless other species could be gathered with minimal technology. Fish schools sheltered in the kelp fronds. Cod, rockfish, and sea bass could be caught with simple hooks or spears. Marine mammals, including seals, sea lions, and sea otters, made kelp forests their home. Seabirds nested on nearby cliffs and islands. The kelp itself was edible, providing essential nutrients including iodine. For people with the knowledge to exploit these resources, the kelp forest offered a virtually inexhaustible food supply. Here's what makes the kelp forest crucial to our migration story. These ecosystems formed an almost continuous chain along the Pacific Rim. A maritime people starting in Japan could theoretically follow kelp forests island hopping through the Kurils, across the Aleutians, down the Alaska coast, through British Columbia, along the California coast, and even into South America. After a gap in the tropics where mangrove forests and coral reefs offered alternative rich ecosystems, kelp forests picked up again along the cold water Humboldt Current off Peru and Chile. This concept, first articulated by archaeologist John Erlandson and marine ecologists, became known as the Kelp Highway hypothesis. The Kelp Highway theory revolutionized thinking about early American migration. The traditional model focused exclusively on overland routes following game animals across Beringia and then south through an ice-free corridor. But archaeological evidence kept contradicting this simple picture. Sites in South America dated earlier than the ice-free corridor opened. Pre-Clovis peoples appeared in locations that would have been extremely difficult to reach by an interior route. The coastal migration theory offered elegant solutions to these problems. By 16,000 years ago, the North Pacific coast offered a linear migration route that was essentially unobstructed and entirely at sea level, stretching from Northeast Asia into the Americas. But could Ice Age people actually travel such distances by water? Skeptics argued that boat technology hadn't developed sufficiently that early. The archaeological evidence that changed minds came from unexpected places. In Japan, sites dating back 35,000 years contain obsidian sourced from islands that could only be reached by boat. This proves that maritime technology capable of open ocean voyages existed in the North Pacific region well before the peopling of the Americas. In Australia, humans arrived at least 50,000 years ago, and possibly as early as 65,000 years ago. Australia was never connected to mainland Asia by land bridges, meaning those first Australians absolutely required seafaring technology. If humans could reach Australia tens of thousands of years ago, crossing shorter distances along the Pacific Rim becomes entirely plausible. Recent oceanographic research has added crucial details about when coastal migration would have been most favorable. Paleoclimatologists have identified specific time windows when conditions were optimal. Between 24,500 and 22,000 years ago, and again between 16,400 and 14,800 years ago, the Pacific coast offered the best combination of accessible coastline, available resources, and navigable ocean conditions. These periods coincide remarkably well with genetic estimates of when human populations began diversifying in the Americas. The ocean currents themselves played a critical role. During the height of the Ice Age, the Alaska coastal current, which today flows northward, was much weaker. Massive amounts of fresh water, now pouring into the ocean from glacial melt, weren't present. This meant that traveling south along the coast by boat would have been easier, not fighting against strong opposing currents. As the Bulling-Allard warming period began around 15,000 years ago, accelerating ice sheet melt increased freshwater influx and strengthened a northward flowing current. This would have made southward coastal travel more challenging, potentially creating a migration hiatus until conditions stabilized again. Archaeological sites along the Pacific Northwest coast provide tantalizing glimpses of early maritime peoples. In California's Channel Islands, sites contain evidence of human activity dating back 13,000 years, including what may be the earliest fishhooks found in the Americas. These were people with sophisticated maritime technology who hunted marine mammals, caught deep water fish, and gathered shellfish. Significantly, reaching the Channel Islands required boats, since these locations were never connected to the mainland, even during maximum sea level lowering. The presence of Western STEM tradition projectile points, distinct from Clovis technology, suggests these maritime peoples represented a different cultural tradition. Evidence of ancient seaweed consumption provides another compelling link. At Monte Verde in Chile, archaeologists found remains of 9 different types of seaweed, including kelp species that grow only in coastal marine environments. The site lies far inland today, but these marine plant remains prove the inhabitants had coastal connections and knowledge of marine resources. Similarly, analysis of ancient middens along the Pacific coast reveals extensive use of kelp forest resources going back to the earliest periods of human occupation. The tragedy for archaeology is that the best evidence for coastal migration remains underwater. As sea levels rose following the Ice Age, the ocean submerged exactly those coastal areas where early maritime peoples would have lived. Archaeological sites that once sat on beaches and in coastal forests now lie under 10 to 120 meters of water. Underwater archaeology in these areas is expensive, technically challenging, and limited in scope. We are essentially trying to understand a book when most of the pages have been torn out and dropped in the ocean. Yet even with this handicap, the evidence that does exist paints a compelling picture of sophisticated maritime adaptation stretching back to the earliest people of the Americas. The world beneath the waves holds secrets that are only beginning to emerge. Chapter 3. The first footsteps: you're holding a stone tool in your hand. It's roughly chipped, weighing perhaps half a pound, fitting comfortably in your palm. This simple object represents one of the most controversial discoveries in American archaeology. The question isn't just what it is, but when it was made. And that single question has the power to rewrite everything we thought we knew about when humans first arrived in the Americas. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists operated under a seemingly solid consensus. The first Americans were the Clovis people, who appeared in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago. This theory wasn't based on speculation. In the 1930s, near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, excavators discovered distinctive stone spear points buried alongside the bones of extinct mammoths. The association was clear and undeniable. Humans with these particular tools had hunted Ice Age megafauna. Radiocarbon dating placed the Clovis culture between approximately 13,500 and 12,800 years ago. For decades, this became the foundational story of American prehistory. Before Clovis, the continent was empty. Clovis represented humanity's first footfall on American soil. The Clovis first model made logical sense within its framework. According to this theory, Clovis people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia and then moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the retreating Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. Once south of the ice, they rapidly expanded across both continents, their distinctive technology spreading from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast and eventually south to South America. The speed of this expansion seems supported by the archaeological record. Clovis points appeared suddenly and spread rapidly across the continent. Within just a few centuries, this technology was everywhere. But here's where the story started unraveling. As more archaeological sites were excavated and more sophisticated dating techniques developed, troubling inconsistencies emerged. Sites in South America, particularly Monte Verde in Chile, were producing dates older than Clovis. If the first Americans had to wait for the ice-free corridor to open before moving south, and that corridor didn't open until around 13,000 years ago, how could people already be living in Chile 14,500 years ago? The math simply didn't work. For Clovis people to reach southern South America in just 500 years would have required migration speeds that seemed impossible given the technology and population densities of the time. Individual archaeologists began challenging the Clovis first orthodoxy, often at significant professional risk. Claiming to have found pre-Clovis sites invited intense skepticism and sometimes outright hostility from the archaeological establishment. Many careers were damaged or destroyed by the controversy. The requirements for proving a pre-Clovis site were extraordinarily rigorous. You needed unambiguous human artifacts, perfect stratigraphic context showing they were in undisturbed deposits, multiple independent dating methods all pointing to the same time frame, and ideally, human remains or other biological evidence that couldn't be questioned. Most proposed pre-Clovis sites failed one or more of these tests and were rejected. Then came the breakthrough discoveries that couldn't be dismissed. At Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, archaeologist James Adavasio conducted meticulous excavations over decades that revealed evidence of human occupation potentially as early as 16,000 years ago. The site showed clear stratigraphy, with earlier levels beneath layers containing later materials. Stone tools, fire pits, and cultural remains were unambiguous. While debate continues about the earliest dates, even conservative estimates place human activity at Meadowcroft before the Clovis horizon. The careful, methodical nature of the work made it difficult to dismiss. In Texas, the Buttermilk Creek Complex produced more than 16,000 stone artifacts in secure context dating between 13,000 to 115,500 years ago. These included blades and bifaces that appeared to represent the technological tradition from which Clovis points evolved. Rather than appearing suddenly and fully formed, Clovis technology had predecessors and developmental stages. This made far more sense than the alternative, which required believing that a complete and sophisticated stoneworking technology materialized from nothing. Oregon's Paisley Caves provided perhaps the most definitive pre-Clovis evidence. Archaeologist Dennis Jenkins and his team discovered fossilized human coprolites, ancient preserved feces, in cave deposits dating to 14,300 years ago. The DNA analysis confirmed these coprolites came from humans, with genetic markers linking them to modern Native Americans. This wasn't stone tools that might be controversial. This was unquestionable biological evidence of human presence. The same site also yielded Western stem tradition projectile points, a different technology from Clovis, suggesting multiple distinct cultural groups occupied North America before or alongside the Clovis culture. But the site that truly demolished Clovis first was Monte Verde. Located in southern Chile, this site represented everything skeptics had claimed was impossible. It was in South America, thousands of miles from the supposed Clovis entry point. It dated to at least 14,500 years ago, over 1,000 years before Clovis. And the preservation was extraordinary, because the site had been sealed beneath peat deposits. Organic materials that normally decay survived intact. Archaeologists recovered wooden artifacts, plant remains, chunks of animal hide, medicinal herbs, ropes made from twisted plant fibers, and even remnants of hide-covered shelters. The level of detail was unprecedented. Tom Dillehay, who excavated Monte Verde over many years, faced enormous skepticism. The Clovis first paradigm was so entrenched that even clear evidence was initially dismissed. But Dillehay did something unusual. He published everything. The final report ran to 1,100 pages, documenting every artifact, every piece of context, every detail of the excavation and analysis. In 1997, a blue-ribbon panel of leading Paleontological specialists visited Monte Verde to examine the evidence firsthand. After careful review, they concluded that Monte Verde was genuine, well-dated, and definitively pre-Clovis. This represented a watershed moment. The archaeological establishment had to acknowledge that Clovis first was wrong. What made Monte Verde's evidence so compelling wasn't just the dates, but what those dates meant. The site sat nearly 10,000 miles south of the Bering Strait. If people were living there 14,500 years ago, they must have entered the Americas significantly earlier to allow time for that long journey. The ice-free corridor between the ice sheets wasn't passable until around 13,000 years ago, meaning the Monte Verde people couldn't have used that route. The only alternative was coastal migration, and that meant people with boats, maritime technology, and knowledge of marine resources. Everything about the traditional Clovis first model had to be reconsidered. Recent discoveries have pushed potential dates even earlier. At Chiquiribu Cave in Mexico, researchers reported finding stone tools and other evidence suggesting human presence as far back as 30,000 years ago. If verified, this would mean humans reached the Americas during the last glacial maximum when ice sheets were near their maximum extent. Such early dates remain controversial and require additional confirmation, but they illustrate how dramatically the timeline has shifted. What once seemed impossible, human presence in the Americas before Clovis, is now not just accepted but recognized as occurring thousands of years earlier than we once thought possible. The technological evidence also tells an important story. Clovis points are distinctive and beautiful, with their characteristic fluting where a channel flake was removed from the base. They represent sophisticated stoneworking technique requiring considerable skill. But Western stem points, found at sites like Paisley Caves, represent a completely different technological tradition. These points are narrower, lack fluting, and require different manufacturing techniques. The coexistence of these different technologies suggests that multiple groups with distinct cultural traditions populated the Americas. Rather than a single migration wave producing the Clovis culture, we now understand the peopling of the Americas as a complex process involving multiple migrations, possibly from different source populations, taking different routes and bringing different technologies and cultural practices. Genetic evidence has reinforced this picture of complexity. Ancient DNA analysis reveals that Native American populations descended from a single source population that diverged from East Asian populations around 36,000 years ago. But this ancestral group then split into at least two distinct lineages around 13,000 years ago, right around the time of Clovis. Some genetic signatures found in South American populations, but not North American ones, suggest the possibility of additional migrations, or more complex population movements than a simple north-to-south wave. Population Y, a mysterious genetic signature found scattered in some South American populations and also in ancient remains from East Asia, hints at population connections we're only beginning to understand. What emerges from all this evidence is a picture radically different from the simple story taught for decades. The first footsteps in the Americas were untaken by Clovis hunters crossing an ice-free corridor 13,000 years ago. They were taken thousands of years earlier, possibly by multiple groups, using different routes including coastal pathways, bringing different technologies and cultural traditions. Some of these early populations may have thrived and become ancestors of later peoples. Others may have died out, leaving only traces in the archaeological and genetic record. The story is messier, more complex, and far more interesting than we ever imagined. Those first footsteps didn't mark a single moment, but a process that unfolded over thousands of years, as humans explored, adapted, and ultimately populated two continents that were, to them, entirely new worlds waiting to be discovered. Chapter 4. The Clovis Mystery. Picture yourself standing at an archaeological site in Montana. It's 1968, and construction workers have just made a remarkable discovery. Buried beneath layers of earth, surrounded by over 100 stone and bone artifacts, all stained with red ochre, lies the skeleton of an infant. This child, who died approximately 12,800 years ago, would become known as Anzic I, and his genome would unlock secrets about the Clovis people that had eluded archaeologists for decades. The Clovis culture gets its name from that original New Mexico site discovered in the 1930s, but it's defined by much more than geography. What makes something Clovis is a distinctive technological package. The most recognizable element is the Clovis point itself. These are not crude implements. They represent the pinnacle of stonework and craftsmanship. A typical Clovis point measures about 4 inches long and 1/3 of an inch thick. They were made from high-quality stone, jasper, chert, obsidian, materials that fracture in predictable ways, allowing precise shaping. The defining characteristic is the flute, shallow concave grooves extending from the base toward the tip. Creating these flutes required tremendous skill. One mistimed strike could shatter hours of careful work. But here's what makes Clovis points truly remarkable. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago and spread across North America with astonishing speed. Within just a few centuries, Clovis technology dominated from Washington state to Florida, from Canada to Mexico. More than 10,000 Clovis points have been discovered at over 1,500 locations. They even appear in similar form as far south as Venezuela. No other archaeological culture has dominated such a vast territory so rapidly. It's as if someone turned on a switch and Clovis culture lit up the entire continent simultaneously. The mystery deepens when you examine where the stone for these points came from. Archaeological analysis reveals that Clovis peoples were extraordinarily mobile. At many sites, the stone tools were made from materials sourced hundreds of kilometers away. In one documented case, stone had traveled over 900 kilometers from its origin to where the finished tool was found. This tells us several things. Clovis people maintained extensive social networks across vast distances. They had detailed knowledge of the landscape and resource locations. And they were highly mobile, moving across the continent with apparent ease. Archaeologists describe them as high-technology foragers who use sophisticated tools to maintain access to resources while being constantly on the move. What were Clovis people hunting? The early discoveries next to mammoth bones created an image that persists in popular culture. Heroic hunters bringing down massive mammoths in dramatic confrontations. Museum dioramas typically show this scene, with brave men thrusting spears into the faces of enraged elephants, while women and children watched nervously from a safe distance. But as archaeologists dug deeper, literally and figuratively, this picture became more nuanced. Yes, Clovis peoples hunted mammoths. Evidence from multiple sites confirms this. But they also hunted mastodons, extinct forms of bison, horses, and numerous other species. They consumed smaller animals and gathered plant foods. The emphasis on mammoth hunting may have been exaggerated by preservation bias. Mammoth bones are large, distinctive, and preserve well. The remains of rabbits or plant foods are far less likely to survive thousands of years. Recent analysis has revealed unexpected details about Clovis life. At the La Preel site in Wyoming, archaeologists found bone needles made from jackrabbit, red fox, and feline bones, possibly from bobcat, lynx, cougar, or even the extinct American cheetah. These needles weren't just tools. They tell us that Clovis peoples were creating tailored clothing from animal furs, sophisticated enough to require careful stitching. They were processing hides from multiple species, suggesting they understood the different properties of various furs. Fox fur is incredibly warm. Rabbit fur is soft and insulating. Cat pelts are durable, and water-resistant. These weren't random choices, but deliberate selection of materials for specific purposes. The Anzac I burial opened an entirely new window into Clovis culture. When geneticists sequenced the infant's genome, the results were stunning. This child showed clear genetic links to modern Native Americans, particularly those from Central and South America. His Y chromosome belonged to haplogroup Q054, common among contemporary Native Americans. His mitochondrial DNA was haplogroup D4H3A, rare today, but apparently more common in the earliest indigenous Americans. Most significantly, the genome revealed that Clovis people were directly ancestral to the majority of Native American populations throughout both continents. This single child, SDN, proved that Clovis wasn't a dead end or a side branch, but part of the main trunk of the Native American family tree. But this raises as many questions as it answers. If Clovis people were ancestors of so many Native American groups, why is their distinctive technology so short-lived? The Clovis culture appears around 13,000 years ago and disappears, or at least transforms into something different, by 12,600 years ago. That's a span of only 400 to 500 years. Archaeological cultures typically persist for thousands of years, gradually evolving and changing. Clovis seems to appear suddenly, dominate the continent, then vanish just as rapidly. What happened? Several theories attempt to explain the Clovis disappearance. Climate change represents one possibility. Around 12,900 years ago, Earth entered the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling that lasted until about 11,700 years ago. Temperatures dropped dramatically. This rapid climate shift would have stressed ecosystems and the megafauna populations that Clovis peoples hunted. If their subsistence strategies were closely tied to specific animals and environments, sudden climate change could have forced rapid cultural adaptation. The Clovis culture might not have vanished so much as transformed into different regional adaptations, which we recognize archaeologically as distinct cultures, even though the people themselves were continuous. The megafauna extinction event coincides suspiciously with the Clovis period. During the late Pleistocene, North America hosted an incredible diversity of large mammals. Then, around 13,000 to 11,000 years ago, most of them disappeared. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, horses, camels, and dozens of other species went extinct. Did Clovis hunters drive these animals to extinction? The overkill hypothesis suggests that highly efficient human hunters encountering naive prey populations could have hunted them to death within a few centuries. Large mammals reproduce slowly. They have long gestation periods, produce few offspring, and take years to reach maturity. Even modest hunting pressure could exceed reproductive replacement rates. But the extinction debate remains contentious. A 2012 survey of archaeologists found that 63% believe megafauna extinctions resulted from a combination of factors rather than hunting alone. Climate change stressed populations already under pressure from human predation. Habitat transformation created by both climate shifts and human use of fire reduced available territory. Diseases potentially carried by humans or their dogs might have contributed. The answer likely involves multiple interacting causes rather than a single explanation. What seems clear is that human arrival and megafauna extinction are temporally linked, even if the precise mechanisms remain debated. One particularly intriguing aspect of the Clovis mystery involves their origins. Where did this distinctive technology come from? Early theories suggested that Clovis represented Siberian traditions brought across Beringia. Archaeologists searched for Clovis points or their precursors in Asian sites. None have ever been found. Clovis technology appears to be an American invention, developed after the founding populations arrived. This suggests a period of technological innovation and development within the Americas. The recently discovered Buttermilk Creek complex in Texas might represent this developmental stage, showing simpler tools that could have evolved into the refined Clovis technology. Another mystery surrounds Clovis' social organization and population density. The Clovis people maintained technological and stylistic consistency across enormous distances. This implies communication, interaction, and shared cultural traditions among groups separated by thousands of miles. Yet population densities must have been extremely low. The Americas were vast and recently peopled. Groups would have been small and scattered. How did they maintain cultural cohesion? Long-distance movement of individuals or goods, regular gatherings at specific locations, and maintenance of kinship networks across great distances all represent possibilities. But with such limited archaeological evidence, much of Clovis' social life remains speculative. The religious or symbolic life of Clovis peoples remains almost entirely mysterious. The Anzic burial represents the only known Clovis burial, making it impossible to generalize about mortuary practices. The red ochre covering the artifacts suggests symbolic importance. Ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment, appears in burials and ritual contexts worldwide and far back in human prehistory. Its presence in the Anzic burial hints at spiritual beliefs and ceremonial practices, but what those beliefs were remains unknown. Did Clovis peoples have shamans, creation stories, explanations for the world around them? Almost certainly yes, but the details are lost to time. What we can say with confidence is that the Clovis culture represents a pivotal moment in American prehistory. For a brief period, a distinctive technological tradition united peoples across half a continent. The makers of these elegant stone points were skilled hunters, sophisticated toolmakers, and the ancestors of millions of people who would go on to create the rich diversity of Native American cultures. But Clovis wasn't the beginning of the story. They had predecessors, and their end wasn't an ending but a transformation, as their descendants adapted to changing circumstances and developed new ways of living in the Americas. The Clovis mystery remains one of American archaeology's most fascinating puzzles, with each new discovery adding pieces while raising new questions. Chapter 5. Breaking the Ice-Free Corridor. Imagine standing at the edge of an ice wall stretching to the horizon in every direction. Behind you, the grasslands of Beringia extend northward. Ahead, a narrow valley cuts between two massive glaciers, walls of ice rising hundreds of feet on either side. This passage, no more than a few kilometers wide in places, represents the only land route from Alaska into the heart of North America. This is the ice-free corridor, and for decades, it was considered the highway for humanity's entry into the Americas. But recent discoveries have revealed that this corridor was less of a highway and more of a nearly impassable barrier. The concept of an ice-free corridor emerged from geological observations about how ice sheets behaved during the last ice age. Two enormous ice masses dominated the northern landscape. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada east of the Rocky Mountains, extending south into what is now the northern United States. At its maximum, this single ice sheet was larger than the entire continent of Antarctica. The Cordilleran ice sheet blanketed the western mountains and coastal ranges. When both ice sheets reached their maximum extent, they merged, creating a continuous frozen barrier stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the northern United States. Nothing could pass through this solid wall of ice. But ice sheets aren't static. They grow and shrink in response to climate variations. As temperatures warmed at the end of the Ice Age, the margins of these glaciers began to retreat. Because the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets responded differently to warming, a gap began to open between them. Theoretically, this corridor provided a viable route for humans to travel south from Beringia into the unglaciated parts of North America. The Clovis first model depended heavily on this corridor. According to that theory, Clovis peoples waited in Beringia for the corridor to open, then moved south approximately 13,000 years ago, bringing their distinctive technology with them. Here's where the geological evidence started contradicting the archaeological story. Geologists studying the timing of ice sheet retreat consistently concluded that the corridor did not become truly passable until around 13,000 to 12,500 years ago. But Monte Verde in Chile dated to 14,500 years ago. Paisley Caves in Oregon showed human occupation by 14,300 years ago. Multiple pre-Clovis sites across North and South America all dated earlier than the corridor opened. The timeline simply didn't work. If the corridor wasn't passable, how did these people get there? Recent research has made the corridor theory even more problematic. The issue isn't just whether a physical gap existed between the ice sheets, but whether that gap could support human life. A team of researchers analyzing ancient lake sediments, pollen, and other paleoenvironmental data made a startling discovery. When the ice-free corridor first opened, it was essentially a biological desert. The early environment was dominated by glacial meltwater, barren landscapes of rock and gravel, and ice-dammed lakes prone to catastrophic flooding. There were virtually no plants, which meant no animals, which meant nothing for humans to eat. The corridor might have been ice-free, but it wasn't life-supporting. Biological productivity in the newly deglaciated landscape increased slowly. Initial plant colonization consisted mainly of hardy pioneer species, mosses, lichens, and eventually tough grasses and low shrubs. These vegetation communities had to establish themselves from scratch, either spreading from small refugia that had survived near the ice margins or migrating in from distant, unglaciated regions. By 17,000 years ago, birch forests were advancing across former tundra in Beringia, indicating the landscape was becoming more productive. But the corridor itself lagged behind. Analysis suggests the earliest possible viability of the ice-free corridor as a human migration route was until approximately 11,500 years ago, significantly later than required by the archaeological evidence. Think about what traversing this corridor would have meant for early peoples. The distance from Alaska to Montana through the corridor spans roughly 1,500 kilometers. That's like walking from New York to Miami, except instead of passing through populated areas with resources and infrastructure, you're traveling through a recently deglaciated wasteland. No trees for firewood or shelter construction. No game animals to hunt. Limited edible plants. Glacial meltwater streams too silty and mineral-laden to drink safely. Cold winds funneling between ice walls hundreds of feet high. And remember, these are family groups with children and elders, not just young, fit adventurers. They would need to carry everything necessary for survival for what could be weeks or months of travel. Some researchers have proposed an earlier opening of the corridor. Cosmogenic exposure dating, a technique that determines when landscapes were last exposed to cosmic rays and therefore no longer covered by ice, suggests the possibility of an ice-free corridor existing as early as 25,000 years ago. If true, this could potentially explain very early pre-Clovis sites. But this interpretation remains controversial. Even if the corridor was physically ice-free at that time, the biological viability question remains unanswered. An ice-free route isn't useful for human migration if nothing can live there. The interior route theory also faces archaeological challenges. If the ice-free corridor was the primary migration route, we should find a clear trail of archaeological sites marking this path. Early occupation sites should cluster along the corridor route. Instead, the earliest securely dated sites are on the coasts or far to the south. There is a suspicious absence of very early sites in the locations where corridor theory predicts they should be most concentrated. This pattern is exactly opposite what corridor migration would produce, but consistent with coastal migration theories. Interestingly, the ice-free corridor may have played a role in later population movements, even if it wasn't the initial route into the Americas. Genetic evidence suggests that some Native American populations, particularly Nadine-speaking peoples of Western North America, have distinct genetic signatures consistent with later migrations. The corridor could have served as a route for these subsequent movements once it became biologically viable. The landscape would have been far more hospitable by 10,000 years ago, with established plant communities, animal populations, and reliable water sources. Groups moving south at this later time would have faced challenges, but nothing like the barren wasteland encountered by potential earlier migrants. The corridor question reveals something important about how scientific understanding evolves. For decades, the ice-free corridors seemed like the obvious, perhaps only, explanation for how humans reached the Americas. It was taught in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and accepted as established fact. But as more sophisticated dating techniques developed, as paleoenvironmental reconstruction methods improved, and as archaeological discoveries accumulated, the corridor theory became increasingly difficult to sustain. The evidence simply didn't fit the model. This required scientists to reconsider fundamental assumptions and look for alternative explanations. The coastal migration theory offered a solution that explained the evidence far better. The Pacific coast was open and biologically productive thousands of years before the interior corridor became viable. Kelp forests and other marine ecosystems provided abundant resources. Island hopping and coastal travel using boats avoided the need to traverse the glaciated wastelands. The archaeological sites, though many are now underwater, align far better with coastal routes than interior ones. Genetic evidence showing rapid population divergence fits better with boat travel than slow overland migration. Every line of evidence points toward the coast rather than the corridor. But breaking established paradigms isn't easy. Science is supposed to be objective, following evidence wherever it leads. In practice, scientists are humans with egos, careers, and intellectual investments in particular theories. The Clovis first model and its associated ice-free corridor theory represented decades of research by respected scholars. Challenging this model meant challenging powerful voices in the field. Young researchers who proposed pre-Clovis sites or coastal migration theories often faced intense skepticism, difficulties getting published, and professional obstacles. The shift in thinking happened gradually, as the weight of evidence became overwhelming, and as the old guard retired and younger, more open-minded scholars took leadership roles. Today, most archaeologists accept that the interior ice-free corridor was not the primary route for the initial peopling of the Americas. It may have served as a later migration route, and it certainly would have been used by Native American populations moving across the continent once it became viable. But the first Americans almost certainly took a different path. The corridor remains important for understanding North American geography during the Ice Age, for studying how ice sheets behave, and for reconstructing paleoenvironments. It's just not the migration highway it was once thought to be. The breaking of the ice-free corridor theory represents more than just a correction to the scientific record. It's a reminder that we must follow evidence even when it contradicts cherished ideas. It demonstrates the importance of interdisciplinary research, combining archaeology with geology, paleoclimatology, genetics, and other fields. It shows how new technologies and methods can transform understanding. And it illustrates that the story of human migration is more complex, more sophisticated, and ultimately more interesting than simple models suggest. The first Americans weren't following a convenient corridor. They were pioneers navigating complex landscapes, adapting to diverse environments, and ultimately succeeding in populating two continents through skill, ingenuity, and remarkable resilience. Chapter 6. The Kelp Highway Revolution. You're standing in a small boat made from animal hides stretched over a wooden frame. The coastline lies perhaps a kilometer to your left, mountains rising dramatically from the sea. Ahead and behind, the coast extends as far as you can see. Below your boat, Towering forests of kelp sway in the current, and you can see fish darting between the fronds. A seal surfaces nearby, regards you with curiosity, then dives. This isn't fantasy. This could have been the daily reality for some of the first Americans, maritime peoples, who followed the Pacific Rim from Asia to the Americas. The Kelp Highway hypothesis fundamentally reimagines how the Americas were peopled. Instead of overland hunters following mammoth herds across frozen wastes, picture maritime peoples traveling by boat along productive coastlines, harvesting resources from one of Earth's richest ecosystems. This wasn't a desperate flight or an accidental discovery. It was a deliberate expansion by peoples who had already mastered coastal living and saw opportunity in following familiar environments into new territory. Let me explain what makes kelp forests so extraordinary. Kelp isn't a plant but a brown algae, though that technical distinction matters little to anyone depending on these ecosystems. Giant kelp, the dominant species along the North Pacific Rim, grows with astonishing speed. Under ideal conditions, it can add 60 centimeters to its length in a single day. Mature kelp reaches the surface from depths of 40 meters, creating vertical structures that transform underwater environments. These three-dimensional forests provide habitat at multiple levels. Near the bottom, the holdfasts, root-like structures that anchor kelp to rocks, create shelter for crabs, lobsters, and juvenile fish. In the mid-water, the kelp blades themselves harbor countless invertebrates. At the surface, the floating canopy provides rafts for sea otters and haul-out spots for seals. The productivity of kelp forests rivals tropical rainforests. Primary productivity measures how much plant matter is created through photosynthesis. Kelp forests generate massive amounts of biomass that supports complex food webs. Herbivores, like sea urchins, graze on the kelp. These herbivores become prey for sea otters, fish, and other predators. Zooplankton swarms attract small fish, which attract larger predators. Marine mammals hunt in kelp forests. Seabirds dive from above. The entire system pulses with life. For humans with the knowledge to exploit these resources, kelp forests offered what archaeologist John Erlandson calls a kind of kelp highway extending from Asia to South America. What could maritime peoples harvest from kelp forest ecosystems? Start with shellfish. Mussels, clams, abalone, sea urchins, and dozens of other species could be gathered from rocks and kelp holdfasts with no technology beyond hands and perhaps simple digging tools. Shellfish provide protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and essential minerals, including iodine. Gathering shellfish doesn't require boats or sophisticated equipment. Even children can participate. Archaeological sites up and down the Pacific coast show that shellfish were consistently exploited from the earliest periods of human occupation. Fish represent another crucial resource. Kelp forests harbor incredible fish diversity. Rockfish, lingcod, sea bass, and numerous other species shelter in the kelp. Some could be speared or caught with hooks. Others might be trapped in weirs or nets. The Channel Islands sites in California, occupied over 13,000 years ago, have yielded what may be the earliest fish hooks in the Americas. These aren't crude implements, but sophisticated tools showing clear understanding of fish behavior and anatomy. The presence of bones from deep water species at some sites indicates that ancient peoples were fishing in offshore waters, not just gathering from tide pools. Marine mammals offered high-value resources. Seals and sea lions provided meat, fat, and hides. Rendered seal fat could be stored and used for cooking, lighting, or waterproofing. Seal skins made excellent waterproof clothing and could be used for boat construction. Sea otters, which shelter in kelp forests, have the densest fur of any mammal, making their pelts incredibly valuable. Even whales, though more challenging to hunt, occasionally became available when animals beached or could be driven ashore. The Maka people of the Pacific Northwest maintained whaling traditions into historic times, demonstrating that maritime peoples could successfully hunt, even the largest marine mammals. Don't forget seabirds and their eggs. Coastal cliffs host enormous colonies of nesting seabirds. Murres, puffins, cormorants, and gulls nest in the thousands or millions at productive sites. The birds themselves could be caught, but eggs represented particularly valuable resources. High in protein and fat, seabird eggs could be harvested in massive quantities during nesting season. Some historic Northwest Coast peoples dried eggs for storage, creating a preserved protein source for leaner times. Archaeological sites consistently show exploitation of seabird colonies from the earliest occupations. The kelp itself was edible. Multiple kelp species contain nutrients including iodine, essential for proper thyroid function, and particularly important for pregnant women and developing children. Historic Northwest Coast peoples harvested kelp for food, either eating it fresh or drying it for storage. The presence of multiple seaweed species, including kelp, at Monte Verde in Chile, proves that ancient peoples recognized and utilized marine plants. This wasn't random. It shows sophisticated ecological knowledge passed down through generations. Now consider the geography. Kelp forests of various species form an almost continuous chain along the Pacific Rim. Starting in Japan, you could follow kelp forests north through the Curls, across the Aleutians, down the Alaska coast, through British Columbia, along Washington, Oregon, and California, all the way to Baja. After a tropical gap where mangrove forests and coral reefs provide alternative rich coastal ecosystems, kelp forests resume along the cold Humboldt Current off Peru and Chile. A maritime people familiar with kelp forest resources could theoretically travel this entire route without ever needing to adapt to radically different environments. The same skills, technologies, and knowledge that worked in Asia would function in the Americas. But could Ice Age peoples actually travel such distances by water? Critics of coastal migration theories long argued that boat technology wasn't sufficiently developed. This skepticism has evaporated under the weight of evidence. In Japan, sites dating back 35,000 years contain obsidian sourced from islands requiring water crossings. In the Indonesia-Australia region, humans reached Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, possibly 65,000 years ago. Australia was never connected to mainland Asia by land bridges. Those first Australians absolutely required sophisticated maritime technology capable of multi-day open ocean voyages. If humans could reach Australia tens of thousands of years ago, the much shorter island-hopping distances along the Pacific Rim seem entirely achievable. Recent paleoclimate research has identified specific windows when coastal migration would have been most favorable. Between approximately 24,000 and 22,000 years ago, and again between 16,400 and 14,800 years ago, the Pacific coast offered optimal conditions. Sea levels were lower, exposing more coastline. Ice sheets had retreated sufficiently to open coastal passages. Ocean currents were favorable for southward travel. These windows correspond remarkably well with genetic estimates of when Native American populations began diversifying. The oceanographic conditions matter more than you might think. The Alaska coastal current today flows northward, making southward travel challenging. But during the Ice Age, this current was much weaker. The massive influx of glacial meltwater that drives the modern current wasn't present. Without that opposing flow, traveling south by boat would have been significantly easier. As the climate warmed and ice sheets began melting rapidly, the increasing freshwater influx strengthened the northward current, potentially creating a migration hiatus until conditions stabilized. Archaeological evidence, though limited by the submergence of ancient coastlines, supports coastal migration. The Channel Islands sites prove that maritime peoples were active in California by 13,000 years ago. The Western stem tradition, a stone tool technology distinct from Clovis, appears in coastal and near-coastal sites, suggesting different cultural traditions possibly associated with maritime adaptation. Paisley Caves in Oregon, located in the interior but relatively close to the coast, yielded both western stem points and human coprolites dating to 14,300 years ago. The genetic signatures of these ancient peoples link them to Native Americans, confirming they were part of the founding populations. Monte Verde provides perhaps the most compelling coastal migration evidence. The site sits inland today, but the recovered artifacts tell a maritime story. 9 different types of seaweed, including kelp species from cold Pacific waters, were found at the site. These marine plants don't grow inland. They had to be transported from the coast, proving the Monte Verde inhabitants maintained connections to and knowledge of marine environments. The presence of coastal resources at an inland site demonstrates that even groups living away from the ocean retained cultural memory and practical knowledge of maritime adaptation. The tragedy of coastal migration research is that the best evidence lies underwater. During the Ice Age, sea levels stood approximately 120 meters lower than today. The coastlines where maritime peoples would have lived, the beaches where they landed their boats, the camps where they processed marine resources, all now rest beneath the ocean. Underwater archaeology in these areas faces enormous challenges. The sites are deep, scattered across thousands of kilometers of coastline, buried under marine sediments, and expensive to locate and excavate. We're trying to reconstruct history when the ocean has claimed most of the evidence. Despite these challenges, underwater surveys have yielded tantalizing hints. Off California's Channel Islands, submerged landscapes show evidence of human modification. Stone tools have been recovered from underwater contexts. Each discovery expands our understanding, but the full picture remains frustratingly incomplete. It's like trying to understand a civilization when 90% of their settlements are inaccessible. We can see the pattern, but the details remain shadowy. The Kelp Highway hypothesis has revolutionized thinking about the peopling of the Americas, but it's important to understand what it does and doesn't claim. It doesn't argue that coastal migration was the only route, merely that it was likely the primary initial route. Interior routes certainly existed and were used, just probably not as the first entry path. The hypothesis doesn't claim all early Americans were exclusively maritime peoples. Many groups would have exploited both coastal and interior resources, moving seasonally or as opportunities arose. And it doesn't suggest a single migration wave. Multiple groups could have used coastal routes at different times, bringing different traditions and technologies. What the Kelp Highway hypothesis does provide is an ecologically plausible mechanism for rapid migration to South America before the ice-free corridor opened. It explains the early dates at sites like Monte Verde. It accounts for the Western stem tradition and other non-Clovis technologies. It aligns with genetic evidence showing rapid population divergence. It makes sense of the distribution of early sites, which cluster in coastal or near coastal locations rather than along the supposed interior corridor route. Every line of evidence, from archaeology to genetics to paleoclimatology, supports coastal migration as the primary initial route into the Americas. The revolution sparked by the Kelp Highway hypothesis extends beyond just understanding American prehistory. It changes how we think about ancient human capabilities. For too long, Ice Age peoples were portrayed as primitive, barely surviving in harsh environments. The coastal migration model reveals sophisticated maritime peoples with advanced technology, detailed ecological knowledge, and the courage to explore beyond their known world. They weren't helpless victims of circumstances, but active agents shaping their destiny. They mastered one of Earth's most challenging environments and used that mastery to accomplish one of humanity's greatest migrations. Understanding the Kelp Highway also has implications for modern conservation. These ecosystems that supported human migration still exist, though under increasing pressure from climate change, pollution, and overfishing. Kelp forests along the Pacific coast face threats from warming ocean temperatures. Sea urchin population explosions as sea otter populations remain depleted, and coastal development. Recognizing the historical importance of these ecosystems adds another dimension to conservation arguments. These aren't just valuable habitats for fish and marine mammals. They're part of human heritage, environments that literally made the peopling of the Americas possible. The story of the Kelp Highway reminds us that human history is intimately connected to environmental history. We didn't conquer nature through technology. We succeeded by understanding nature, by learning to work with ecosystems rather than against them. The maritime peoples who followed kelp forests from Asia to South America weren't conquering the ocean. They were partnering with it, using their knowledge of marine ecology to find food, navigate safely, and ultimately populate two continents. That relationship between humans and environment, that deep ecological knowledge passed through generations, represents one of our species' greatest achievements. The Kelp Highway wasn't just a route. It was a testament to human ingenuity, adaptability, and our ancient relationship with the sea. Chapter 7. Monte Verde in 1975. A veterinary student was exploring near the small town of Monte Verde in southern Chile when local farmers showed him what they thought was a cow bone eroding from a creek bank. That bone turned out to be from a gomphothere, an extinct elephant relative. This chance discovery would eventually revolutionize our understanding of when and how humans reached the Americas. Monte Verde became the site that finally, definitively, broke the Clovis first paradigm. Tom Delahaye began excavating Monte Verde in 1977. From the beginning, he knew he was dealing with something extraordinary. The site's preservation was unlike anything typically encountered in American archaeology. Monte Verde had been sealed beneath a peat bog, creating anaerobic conditions that prevented organic materials from decaying. While most archaeological sites preserve only stone tools and occasionally bones, Monte Verde yielded wooden artifacts. Plant remains, chunks of animal hide, twisted rope made from plant fibers, and even remnants of wooden structures. It was as if someone had taken a snapshot of daily life 14,000 years ago and preserved it in 3 dimensions. Picture what archaeologists found. The main occupation area showed evidence of rectangular structures, tent-like shelters with wooden frameworks. These weren't simple lean-tos, but planned constructions requiring substantial effort and engineering knowledge. Wooden stakes and planks marked foundation lines. Animal hide had covered these frames, creating weatherproof dwellings. Inside and around these structures, archaeologists recovered the debris of daily life. Stone tools for cutting and scraping. Wooden implements including digging sticks and lance shafts. Hearths with charcoal and burned bone showing where food had been cooked. And plant remains indicating what people ate. The plant evidence revealed sophisticated botanical knowledge. Residents of Monte Verde gathered at least 60 different species of edible and medicinal plants. Wild potatoes provided carbohydrates. Seeds, nuts, berries, and mushrooms added variety and nutrients. Multiple medicinal herbs suggested knowledge of plant properties for treating injuries or illness. But what really caught archaeologists' attention was the seaweed. 9 different types of marine algae, including several kelp species, were found at the site. Monte Verde sits approximately 50 kilometers inland from the Pacific coast. These weren't plants that just happened to drift there. They were deliberately transported, proving the inhabitants maintained active connections to coastal environments and understood the value of marine resources. The animal remains told another story. Monte Verde people hunted extinct megafauna including paleocamelids, ancestors of modern llamas and alpacas, and gomphotheres, elephant-like creatures that roamed South America during the Ice Age. But they also hunted smaller prey like prehistoric horses and deer. The bone fragments were often small, broken, and scorched, indicating the animals had been thoroughly processed and cooked. Many of these large animals couldn't have survived on the vegetation available near Monte Verde itself, suggesting the hunters traveled to different locations to hunt, then brought meat back to the main camp. What made Monte Verde truly revolutionary wasn't just what was found, but when it dated to. Radiocarbon dating placed the main occupation level at approximately 14,500 years ago, possibly extending back to 14,800 years ago. This was over 1,000 years before the Clovis culture appeared in North America. If people were living in southern Chile that early, they must have entered the Americas significantly earlier still. The implications were staggering. The Clovis first model couldn't explain how people reached the southern tip of South America 1,000 years before Clovis supposedly represented the first human presence anywhere in the Americas. Delahaye faced enormous skepticism. The archaeological establishment had invested decades in the Clovis first paradigm. Challenging this model meant challenging powerful voices in the field. Pre-Clovis claims had been made before and repeatedly dismissed. Why should Monte Verde be different? The scrutiny was intense and sometimes hostile. Critics questioned the excavation methods, the dating, the interpretation of artifacts, the stratigraphy, everything. Some criticism was legitimate scientific skepticism. Some bordered on intellectual gatekeeping, defending an established model against inconvenient evidence. Delahaye's response was remarkable. Instead of simply publishing preliminary findings, he committed to comprehensive documentation. The final report on Monte Verde ran to 1,100 pages across multiple volumes. Every artifact was photographed, drawn, and described in detail. Every piece of contextual information was documented. The stratigraphic relationships were mapped precisely. Dating samples and methods were reported exhaustively. Delahaye essentially opened the entire excavation to scrutiny, providing enough information that other archaeologists could evaluate the evidence independently. In 1997, a blue ribbon panel of leading Paleoindian specialists visited Monte Verde to examine the site and evidence firsthand. This delegation included some of the most respected archaeologists in the field, including several who had been skeptical of pre-Clovis claims. They spent days at the site, examining the stratigraphy, reviewing artifacts, and evaluating the evidence. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Monte Verde was a genuine archaeological site. The dating was solid. The evidence for human occupation was clear and unquestionable, and it definitively predated Clovis. This represented a watershed moment. The archaeological establishment acknowledged that Clovis first was wrong. The acceptance of Monte Verde opened floodgates. Other pre-Clovis sites that had been dismissed or marginalized suddenly received more serious consideration. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which had been excavated since the 1970s but remained controversial, gained new credibility. Paisley Caves in Oregon produced incontrovertible evidence of pre-Clovis occupation. The Buttermilk Creek Complex in Texas showed technological developments leading to Clovis. Suddenly, instead of defending the existence of pre-Clovis occupation, archaeologists were trying to determine just how early humans had arrived and by what routes. But Monte Verde held more secrets. Deeper excavations revealed an even older layer, designated Monte Verde I, with stone tools and other evidence potentially dating to 33,000 years ago. If verified, this would push human presence in South America back to a time when ice sheets covered much of North America at their maximum extent. Such early dates remain controversial and haven't been widely accepted by the archaeological community. The evidence is more limited, and the dates are difficult to confirm independently. Delahaye himself has been cautious about these earlier findings, acknowledging that more work is needed. Still, the possibility that humans reached South America much earlier than even the accepted Monte Verde 2 dates suggests. Our understanding of migration chronology may need further revision. What does Monte Verde tell us about the people who lived there? They weren't struggling survivors barely clinging to existence. They were successful, well-adapted people with detailed knowledge of their environment. Their diet was diverse, combining hunted meat with gathered plants and marine resources. They had sophisticated technology, including both stone and wooden tools. They built substantial structures requiring planning and cooperation. They maintained long-distance connections, bringing marine resources from the coast and using stone sourced from distant locations. They processed medicinal plants, suggesting accumulated knowledge of plant properties. In short, they were fully modern humans with capabilities matching any contemporary population elsewhere in the world. The architectural evidence deserves special attention. One structure at Monte Verde wasn't residential, but appears to have served special functions. This U-shaped building had a different orientation than the residential structures and contained unusual artifacts, including what may be medicinal herbs. Some archaeologists interpret this as evidence of ritual or healing activities, possibly associated with shamanic practices. If correct, this would represent some of the earliest evidence of specialized social roles and ceremonial practices in the Americas. The structure suggests that even these early populations had complex social organizations, going beyond simple subsistence activities. Monte Verde also challenges assumptions about technology. The Clovis first model emphasized distinctive stone projectile points as the defining feature of early American cultures. Monte Verde people made stone tools, but their toolkit was relatively simple and showed no connection to Clovis technology. More importantly, stone tools weren't their primary implements. Wood, hide, and plant fibers were apparently more important to daily life than stone. This makes perfect sense in an environment where wood is abundant and high-quality stone may be scarce. But it also suggests that focusing on stone projectile points may give a distorted picture of technological sophistication. The most important tools may have been the ones that don't preserve. The location of Monte Verde itself is significant. It sits at roughly 41 degrees south latitude, near the northern edge of Patagonia. The climate during occupation would have been cold and wet, not radically different from today. This was near the ice sheets that still covered much of southern South America. For people to be living this far south 14,000 years ago, they must have entered the Americas substantially earlier and either migrated south quickly or represented populations that had been in South America for some time. Either scenario requires rethinking migration chronology. Monte Verde's impact extends beyond just establishing pre-Clovis occupation. It demonstrated the importance of sites with exceptional preservation. Most archaeological sites preserve only the most durable materials. Monte Verde showed that under the right conditions, organic materials survive and provide information unavailable from stone tools alone. This has influenced how archaeologists think about site selection for excavation and how they interpret other sites where organic materials haven't survived. What we see at most sites may represent only a fraction of the material culture that existed. The site also highlighted the importance of coastal and maritime connections, even for populations living inland. The seaweed at Monte Verde proves these people maintained active ties to the coast. This supports coastal migration theories by demonstrating that even inland groups retained maritime knowledge and continued to value marine resources. It suggests that the dichotomy between maritime and terrestrial adaptation may be false. Early Americans likely exploited multiple environments opportunistically, using whatever resources were available. Perhaps most importantly, Monte Verde proved that persistence and rigorous methodology could overturn established paradigms. Delahaye spent decades excavating analyzing and defending his findings against skepticism. He didn't just claim Monte Verde was pre-Clovis. He proved it through such exhaustive documentation that denial became impossible. This set a standard for pre-Clovis archaeology. Other researchers learned that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but that such evidence, when properly gathered and documented, can change scientific consensus. Monte Verde didn't just change our understanding of when humans reached the Americas. It changed how archaeology itself is practiced, emphasizing thorough documentation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and willingness to challenge established ideas when evidence demands it. Chapter 8. Giants of the Ice Age. Imagine walking across the North American landscape 15,000 years ago. The first thing that would strike you isn't the cold or the unfamiliar geography. It's the animals. A herd of mammoths moves across the horizon, individuals standing 12 feet tall at the shoulder, their massive curved tusks gleaming in the sunlight. Nearby, a giant ground sloth weighing over 3 tons feeds on tree branches it can reach thanks to its enormous size. In the distance, something moves that makes even the mammoths nervous. It's a short-faced bear, standing over 14 feet tall on its hind legs, the largest carnivorous mammal to ever walk North America. This is the megafauna world that early humans encountered. And it was unlike anything that exists today. The term megafauna refers to large animals, typically those weighing more than 100 pounds. Though in popular usage, it's often applied specifically to the giants, animals weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds. The Americas during the late Pleistocene hosted an extraordinary diversity of these creatures. We've already mentioned mammoths, but there are actually multiple mammoth species. The woolly mammoth, covered in thick fur and adapted to extreme cold, ranged across the northern latitudes. The Colombian mammoth, less hairy but equally massive, inhabited more temperate regions from Canada to Mexico. The Jeffersonian mammoth occupied eastern North America. These weren't just bigger versions of modern elephants. They were distinct species with different adaptations and ecological roles. American mastodons represented an even older lineage. Their ancestors crossed from Asia roughly 15 million years ago, long before mammoths appeared. Mastodons were shorter and stockier than mammoths, with different tooth structure reflecting different diets. While mammoths grazed primarily on grasses and sedges, mastodons browsed on leaves, branches, and bark. This dietary difference meant mammoths and mastodons could coexist without directly competing, occupying slightly different ecological niches. Mastodon fossils are commonly found in areas that were forested or parkland during the Ice Age, while mammoth remains appear more often in grassland environments. But elephant relatives weren't the only giants. Giant ground sloths, relatives of today's tree sloths but terrestrial and enormous, browsed on vegetation across the Americas. Megatherium, the largest ground sloth species, weighed up to 4 tons and stood 15 feet tall when rearing on its hind legs. Even smaller ground sloths exceeded the size of modern bears. These animals had massive claws, not for hunting, but for pulling down branches and digging for roots. Some species occupied tropical and subtropical forests. Others adapted to grasslands, and a few even lived in coastal environments. The predators that hunted these herbivores were equally impressive. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth reaching 7 inches long specialized in taking down large prey. Despite their fearsome appearance, these weren't mindless killing machines. The elongated canines were relatively fragile and required precise use. Saber-toothed cats probably targeted specific vulnerable areas like the throat or belly, using their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground before delivering a killing bite. Dire wolves, larger and more robust than modern gray wolves, hunted in packs. Giant short-faced bears, already mentioned, were possibly omnivorous despite their size. that would have been formidable predators. When they chose to hunt, the herbivore diversity extended beyond the giants we've discussed. Ice Age horses, multiple species of them, were smaller and stockier than modern horses, but perfectly adapted to cold environments. Ancient bison, larger than their modern descendants, roamed in vast herds. Camels, yes camels, grazed across North America. The American cheetah, now extinct, pursued swift prey across the grasslands. Giant beavers, weighing 200 pounds, built dams and lodges. Capybaras the size of bears inhabited wetlands. The sheer variety of large mammals was staggering. Then, around 13,000 to 11,000 years ago, most of these giants disappeared. During the late Pleistocene extinction event, approximately 70 to 75% of North American megafauna genera went extinct. In South America, the percentage was even higher. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, horses, camels, giant beavers, and dozens of other species vanished. This wasn't gradual attrition over millions of years. In geological terms, it happened almost instantaneously. Within a few thousand years, maybe only a few centuries in some regions, the megafauna world that had existed for millions of years was gone. What caused this mass extinction? This question has generated one of the most contentious debates in paleontology and archaeology. Three main hypotheses have been proposed, and each has passionate proponents. The overkill hypothesis argues that human hunting drove the extinctions. Climate change proponents contend that rapid environmental shifts killed the megafauna. And the minority suggests that a cosmic impact event, possibly a meteor or comet, triggered the extinctions. Let's examine each theory. The overkill hypothesis, popularized in the 1960s by paleoecologist Paul Martin, argues that human arrival and megafauna extinction are causally linked. The timing is suspicious. Megafauna extinctions cluster around periods when humans first arrived in different regions. In Australia, megafauna disappeared around 40,000 years ago, shortly after human arrival. In the Americas, extinctions peaked between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, coinciding with the expansion of Clovis and other Paleoandean cultures. The extinctions disproportionately affected large animals, exactly what human hunters would target. Species that survived tended to be smaller, faster, or living in environments less accessible to humans. The overkill mechanism makes biological sense. Large mammals reproduce slowly. Mammoths, for instance, had gestation periods of 22 months, typically giving birth to single calves, with females reaching reproductive maturity only after about 15 years. Even modest hunting pressure could exceed reproductive replacement rates. Moreover, American megafauna had never encountered human hunters before. They lacked the wariness that African and Asian animals had developed over hundreds of thousands of years of coexisting with humans. Archaeological sites show clear evidence of human hunting. At several locations, projectile points have been found embedded in mammoth bones. Stone tools show wear patterns consistent with butchering large animals. Computer models suggest that even conservative hunting rates could drive megafauna populations to extinction within a few centuries. Climate change advocates point to the dramatic environmental shifts occurring at the end of the Ice Age. Between about 14,000 and 11,000 years ago, the planet's climate was extremely unstable. The Bulling-Allard warming period brought rapid temperature increases. Then the Younger Dryas, beginning around 12,900 years ago, caused abrupt cooling, lasting over 1,000 years. These oscillations transformed habitats rapidly. Open grasslands gave way to forests. Cold-adapted species found their habitats shrinking. Food availability changed. For large mammals with slow reproduction and high food requirements, rapid climate change could be catastrophic. evidence supports climate involvement. Pollen records show dramatic vegetation changes coinciding with megafauna declines. Habitat modeling demonstrates that suitable megafauna territory contracted significantly. The mammoth steppe, that unique grassland ecosystem that supported such rich fauna, largely disappeared as forests expanded. Some megafauna survived longer on remote islands where humans arrived late or not at all. Woolly mammoths persisted on Wrangel Island off Siberia until about 4,000 years ago, over 6,000 years after their mainland extinction. This suggests that in the absence of human hunting, some populations could survive climate change. The cosmic impact hypothesis proposes that a meteor or comet struck Earth around 12,900 years ago, triggering the Younger Dryas cooling and megafauna extinctions. Proponents point to geological markers they interpret as impact evidence, including unusual concentrations of certain elements and microscopic diamonds found in sediments from this period. The hypothesis suggests that the impact ignited widespread fires, created massive dust clouds that cooled the climate, and potentially caused direct mortality through shock waves and heat. Most geologists and archaeologists remain skeptical of this hypothesis. The proposed impact evidence can be explained through other geological processes. No definitive impact crater from this period has been found, and the timing of extinctions doesn't match well with a single, catastrophic event. The current consensus leans toward multiple factors working synergistically. Climate change stressed megafauna populations by reducing habitat and food availability. Human hunting added additional mortality pressure that stressed populations couldn't sustain. Fire, both natural and human-set, transformed landscapes. Disease, potentially introduced by humans or their dogs, may have contributed. Different species in different regions probably faced different combinations of pressures. The extinctions weren't uniform. Some areas lost megafauna earlier than others. Some species disappeared quickly, while others persisted longer. This regional and temporal variation suggests complex causes rather than a single explanation. The human role in megafauna. Extinction remains particularly controversial because it touches on deep questions about human nature and environmental impact. If our ancestors drove magnificent creatures to extinction thousands of years ago, what does that say about us? Some see it as evidence that humans have always been destructive to nature. Others argue it's unfair to judge ancient peoples by modern standards. They were surviving in challenging circumstances, not willfully destroying species they probably didn't realize were disappearing. The extinctions might have been slow enough that no single generation noticed the decline. Regardless of causes, the consequences of megafauna extinction were profound. The loss of large herbivores transformed ecosystems. Without mammoths and other mega-herbivores, vegetation patterns changed. Trees and shrubs that had been browsed and trampled grew unchecked. Grasslands succeeded to forests in many areas. Predator populations crashed without large prey. Scavengers that had depended on megafauna carcasses disappeared or shifted to other food sources. The entire ecological web that had existed for millions of years was disrupted. For humans, the extinctions forced adaptation. Groups that had specialized in mammoth hunting had to diversify their subsistence strategies. Archaeological sites after the extinction show broader diet breadths, with increased emphasis on smaller game, fish, and plant foods. Technology changed as well. The distinctive Clovis points disappeared or evolved into different forms better suited for hunting smaller prey. Regional adaptations became more pronounced as groups specialized in exploiting whatever resources remained available in their territories. The extinction also eliminated potential domestication candidates. In Eurasia, wild horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep survived and were eventually domesticated. providing the foundation for agricultural civilizations. The Americas lost their horses, camels, and most other large mammals that might have been domesticated. This fundamentally shaped the trajectory of human societies in the Americas. Without large draft animals, transportation, agriculture, and warfare developed differently than in Eurasia. The extinction that occurred thousands of years before agriculture was practiced had consequences that reverberated through all subsequent human history. Some megafauna did survive. Bison adapted and persisted, becoming a keystone species for plains cultures. Deer, elk, and moose remained important game animals. Mountain goats and bighorn sheep survived in high-altitude refugia. But the true giants, the animals that made the Ice Age landscape so distinctive, were gone. A few isolated populations lingered in remote locations. The mammoths on Wrangel Island survived until about 2000 BCE. Contemporary with ancient Egypt and the Bronze Age civilizations of the Near East. These last mammoths were essentially living fossils, remnants of a vanished world. When they finally disappeared, the Ice Age megafauna era truly ended. Today, we're left with scattered fossils, bones eroding from riverbanks and quarries. Occasional finds of remarkably preserved specimens in permafrost. These remains allow us to reconstruct what these animals looked like, what they ate, how they lived. But we can never truly know what it was like to share the landscape with such creatures. The early humans who crossed into the Americas encountered a world richer in megafauna than anywhere else on Earth. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of it was gone. Whether that extinction was caused primarily by human hunting, climate change, or some combination remains debated. What's clear is that the Americas early humans discovered was radically different from the Americas their descendants would know. Chapter 9. The DNA Trailing 1968. Construction workers near Wilsall, Montana discovered the burial of an infant surrounded by stone and bone artifacts, all stained with red ochre. For decades, this remained an important archaeological find, the only known Clovis burial. Then, in 2014, geneticists published the complete genome sequence from this child, known as ANZIC-1. What they found revolutionized our understanding of early American populations. The DNA told a story that bones and artifacts alone never could. Connecting past and present across thousands of years. DNA analysis has transformed archaeology in the 21st century, answering questions that traditional methods couldn't address. Who were the first Americans? Where did they come from? When did they arrive? How are modern Native American populations related to ancient peoples and to each other? These questions, debated for over a century based on archaeological and linguistic evidence, can now be approached through genetic data. But interpreting genetic evidence requires understanding both its power and limitations. Let's start with what DNA analysis of ancient and modern populations has revealed about the peopling of the Americas. The fundamental finding is clear and unambiguous. Native Americans descended from populations in northeastern Asia. This might seem obvious given the geographic proximity. The genetic evidence provides specific details. The divergence between ancestral Native Americans and their closest Asian relatives occurred approximately 36,000 years ago, right around the time when the Bering Land Bridge emerged. This timing is remarkable and probably not coincidental. But here's where it gets interesting. The genetic data suggests that this ancestral population didn't immediately rush into the Americas. Instead, they appear to have remained in Beringia for thousands of years, isolated from their Asian relatives. During this period, they developed unique genetic variations that distinguish Native Americans from Asian populations. This Beringian standstill model proposes that a small founding population lived in Beringia for perhaps 10,000 years or more before expanding into the Americas. During this time, they adapted to the harsh environment. developed technologies for surviving in extreme cold, and became a genetically distinct population. The expansion into the Americas south of the ice sheets appears to have begun around 16,000 to 15,000 years ago, based on genetic diversity patterns. When populations split and become isolated, they begin accumulating different mutations. By analyzing the genetic differences between populations and using mutation rates as a molecular clock, scientists can estimate when populations diverged. The genetic evidence suggests rapid population splits and diversification beginning around 15,000 years ago. This timeline matches remarkably well with archaeological evidence for early sites south of the ice sheets. The Anzac 1 genome provided crucial information about the Clovis people specifically. Analysis showed that this infant boy belonged to haplogroups found in modern Native Americans, confirming genetic continuity between Clovis peoples and later populations. More specifically, his genome showed particularly close relationships with modern Central and South American populations. This suggests that Clovis peoples or their close relatives were direct ancestors to groups that populated much of the Americas. The genetic data confirms what archaeologists suspected. Clovis wasn't a dead end but part of the main line of Native American ancestry. But the genetic picture isn't entirely simple. Native Americans show clear evidence of descending from a single ancestral population, but there are hints of complexity. Some researchers have identified what they call population Y, a mysterious genetic signature found scattered in some South American populations. This signature also appears in ancient remains from East Asia, including a 40,000-year-old man found in a Chinese cave. The pattern suggests ancient population structure in Asia, with different lineages that separated tens of thousands of years ago. Some descendants of these different lineages apparently both made it to the Americas, though the details remain unclear. There's also genetic evidence for later migrations into North America. Arctic populations, including Inuit and Aleut peoples, show genetic signatures distinct from other Native Americans, consistent with later arrivals from Siberia. Nadine-speaking peoples of Western North America also show some genetic distinctiveness, though less pronounced. These later migrations probably used the coastal route or interior pathways after the ice sheets retreated, adding to the genetic diversity of Native American populations. One of the most powerful aspects of ancient DNA analysis is its ability to trace maternal and paternal lineages separately. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through mothers, provides one line of evidence. Y chromosome DNA, inherited only through fathers, provides another. Analysis of these different genetic systems reveals that Native Americans descended from a relatively small founding population. The limited genetic diversity compared to Asian populations suggests a population bottleneck, consistent with a small group crossing into Beringia and remaining relatively isolated during the standstill period. The distribution of genetic diversity also tells stories about population movements within the Americas. Generally, genetic diversity is highest in regions occupied longest and decreases in regions populated more recently. South American populations show somewhat lower genetic diversity than North American ones, consistent with populations moving south over time. The pattern suggests rapid initial expansion, followed by regional differentiation as groups adapted to different environments and became reproductively isolated from each other. Ancient DNA has also shed light on controversial questions about possible trans-Pacific migrations. Some researchers propose that peoples from Australia, Melanesia, or Polynesia might have reached South America by sailing directly across the Pacific. Genetic analysis finds no evidence for such migrations contributing significantly to Native American ancestry. While there are interesting genetic signals that require explanation, the overwhelming evidence points to Beringian origins for the vast majority of Native American ancestry. If trans-Pacific contacts occurred, they left little genetic trace. The relationship between genetic and archaeological evidence sometimes creates puzzles. The Western stem tradition, archaeologically distinct from Clovis, raised questions about whether different cultural traditions represented different population groups. Genetic analysis of individuals associated with Western stem points shows they're genetically similar to Clovis peoples. The archaeological differences represent cultural variation within a genetically connected population rather than separate groups. This reminds us that culture and genetics, while related, aren't the same thing. Peoples can share genetic ancestry while developing distinct traditions. One particularly fascinating genetic finding involves adaptation to high altitude. Modern Native American populations living in the Andes show genetic adaptations that help them cope with low oxygen levels at high elevations. These adaptations differ from those found in Tibetan highlanders, representing convergent evolution. The genetic changes occurred relatively recently, probably within the last few thousand years, as populations permanently settled high-altitude regions. This demonstrates that human evolution didn't stop when people reached the Americas. Populations continued adapting to their environments through natural selection. The genetic evidence also addresses questions about population size and demographics. How many people were in the founding population? Genetic diversity patterns suggest the number was small, perhaps only a few thousand at most. How quickly did populations grow? Rapidly, based on the speed with which the Americas were populated. Were there population crashes? The Younger Dryas period shows evidence of population stress in some regions, but not continent-wide collapse. Have Native American populations maintained genetic continuity to the present? Absolutely, though European colonization caused catastrophic population declines and some genetic mixing. Ancient DNA analysis faces significant challenges and limitations. DNA degrades over time, especially in warm or wet conditions. Most ancient remains don't preserve analyzable DNA. This creates geographic bias, with better preservation in cold, dry environments. Ethical considerations are paramount when dealing with ancient human remains. Many Native American communities object to destructive analysis of ancestral remains or consider DNA analysis culturally inappropriate. Researchers increasingly involve Native communities in decisions about ancient DNA research, seeking consent and collaborating on interpretations. The genetic evidence has generally supported and refined archaeological interpretations rather than contradicting them. The coastal migration theory, developed from archaeological and paleoenvironmental evidence, is confirmed by genetic data showing rapid population divergence consistent with boat-enabled movement. The timing of migration suggested by early archaeological sites aligns well with genetic estimates. The Beringian origins proposed based on geography and stone. Tool traditions are confirmed by genetic links to northeastern Asian populations. But genetics adds dimensions that archaeology alone cannot provide. We can trace specific maternal and paternal lineages across thousands of years. We can estimate population sizes and identify bottlenecks. We can detect population mixtures and separate movements. We can identify biological adaptations to environments. We can connect ancient peoples to modern descendants with certainty. This complementarity between archaeological and genetic evidence provides a more complete picture than either approach alone. The story told by DNA is ultimately one of human resilience and adaptability. A small population, diverging from their Asian relatives in the harsh environment of Ice Age Beringia, eventually expanded to populate 2 continents. They adapted to every environment imaginable, from Arctic tundra to Amazonian rainforest, from high Andean peaks to Patagonian grasslands. They diversified culturally and to some degree genetically, developing thousands of distinct languages and cultures. while maintaining biological connections traceable to their common origins. The genetic thread links all Native American peoples to those first pioneers who crossed from Asia tens of thousands of years ago. Modern genetic technology continues to refine our understanding. Ancient DNA analysis improves as techniques advance and more samples are analyzed. Population genetics models become more sophisticated, incorporating archaeological and climatological data to test migration scenarios. Whole genome sequences provide far more information than earlier analyses of limited genetic markers. Each improvement adds details to the picture, sometimes confirming existing theories, sometimes revealing unexpected complexities. The DNA trail from Asia to the Americas tells a story more nuanced than simple narratives of a single migration wave. It reveals a complex process involving initial divergence, periods of isolation, multiple expansions, regional adaptations, and continuing evolution. It connects past and present, linking modern Native Americans to their ancient ancestors through molecules that carry information across millennia. The genetic evidence doesn't replace archaeological, linguistic, or traditional knowledge. It complements them, adding another line of evidence in the ongoing effort to understand one of humanity's greatest journeys. Chapter 10. Living on the edge of Extinction. Picture yourself as part of a small band of perhaps 30 people camped near a glacial lake. The year is 13,000 years ago, right in the middle of the transition from Ice Age to modern climate. Your world is changing with terrifying speed. The mammoths your grandparents hunted are increasingly rare. The climate oscillates wildly between warm and cold periods. The plants and animals you depend on shift their ranges faster than your group can follow. You're living on the edge of extinction, and whether your people survive depends on adaptation, innovation, and a significant measure of luck that this precarious existence wasn't unique to one group or region. Early Americans across both continents faced extraordinary environmental challenges during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Understanding how they survived, how they adapted their subsistence strategies, technology, and social organization to meet these challenges helps us appreciate the remarkable resilience that allowed humans to not just survive but thrive in the Americas. The environmental changes during this period were dramatic. Between approximately 15,000 and 11,000 years ago, Earth's climate was extraordinarily unstable. The Beringia warming, beginning around 14,700 years ago, saw temperatures rise rapidly. Ice sheets began melting at accelerating rates. Sea levels rose. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years were inundated. Then, around 12,900 years ago, the climate suddenly reversed. The Younger Dryas brought a return to nearly glacial conditions. Temperatures in some regions dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. This cooling lasted over 1,000 years before temperatures rose again, marking the beginning of our current Holocene epoch. For people dependent on hunting and gathering, these climate shifts created existential challenges. Animal distributions changed as habitats transformed. Megafauna populations, already stressed, collapsed. Plant communities shifted rapidly. Water sources changed as precipitation patterns altered. Groups that had developed successful subsistence strategies found those strategies suddenly inadequate. Adaptation was essential for survival. We see this adaptation in the archaeological record through changes in technology and subsistence patterns. The Clovis culture, with its emphasis on large game hunting, disappeared or transformed around 12,600 years ago. What replaced it was regional diversity. In the Great Plains, fulsome culture emerged, characterized by different projectile point styles and continued focus on bison hunting, though the bison themselves were smaller than their Ice Age ancestors. In the eastern woodlands, groups adapted to increasingly forested environments, hunting deer and smaller game, fishing, and gathering forest resources. Along coasts, maritime adaptations intensified with increased focus on shellfish, marine mammals, and fishing. The diversification of projectile point styles reflects this regional adaptation. After the relatively uniform Clovis technology, we see an explosion of different point types: Folsom, Plainview, Dalton, Scottsbluff, Eden, and dozens more. Each type represents groups adapting their hunting technology to different prey species and environments. Folsom points, for instance, are smaller and thinner than Clovis, optimized for hunting bison rather than mammoths. Coastal groups develop points and tools suited for marine resources. This technological diversity demonstrates innovation in response to changing circumstances. Subsistence patterns broaden significantly. While Clovis peoples appear to have focused heavily on megafauna, post-Clovis groups exploited wider resource bases. Archaeological sites show increased consumption of small game, rabbits, birds, rodents, and other animals that Clovis peoples largely ignored. Fish bones become more common in sites, especially along rivers and coasts. Plant remains, seeds, nuts, and tubers appear more frequently. This dietary broadening represents a fundamental shift from specialized big game hunting to generalized foraging. Such generalization is typically a response to resource stress. When preferred foods become scarce, successful groups expand their diets to include previously marginal resources. Grinding stones appear more frequently in archaeological sites after about 10,000 years ago. These tools, used for processing seeds, nuts, and other plant foods, signal increased reliance on plant resources. Some researchers interpret this as the beginning of the trajectory that would eventually lead to agriculture in some regions. By intensively exploiting certain plant species, groups began managing and eventually domesticating them. The process was slow, taking thousands of years, but the seeds were planted, so to speak. During this period of environmental stress, social organization probably changed as well. Clovis peoples, with their extensive social networks evident in the long-distance movement of stone materials, maintained connections across vast territories. As populations grew and environments diversified, groups became more territorially bounded. Regional traditions emerged in technology, suggesting reduced contact between distant groups. This doesn't mean complete isolation. Trade networks certainly existed, and gene flow between groups continued. But the continent-spanning unity suggested by Clovis, technology fragmented into regional cultures. The archaeological evidence also hints at increased conflict during this period. Some skeletal remains show evidence of violent trauma. Fortified sites begin appearing in some regions. While interpersonal violence certainly existed earlier, some researchers interpret increased evidence of trauma as reflecting competition for diminishing resources during environmentally stressed periods. This remains controversial, as the sample sizes are small and the evidence ambiguous. But the possibility that resource stress led to increased conflict seems plausible. Ritual and symbolic life probably intensified during this period as well. When facing environmental uncertainty and resource stress, humans typically turn to ritual and religion for explanation and control. The Anzac I burial, with its red ochre and associated artifacts, suggests that Clovis peoples already had elaborate mortuary practices. Later sites show evidence of increasingly complex ceremonial behavior. Rock art traditions begin appearing in many regions. Carefully crafted objects with no obvious utilitarian function suggest symbolic or ritual purposes. These archaeological signatures hint at rich spiritual lives, probably involving efforts to understand and influence the changing world through ritual means. Different regions experience different trajectories. In some areas, environmental change was relatively favorable. The Pacific Northwest, for instance, became more productive as forests developed and salmon runs increased. Groups in these regions probably experienced population growth and increasing cultural complexity. In other regions, like parts of the interior that became arid, populations may have declined or reorganized. This regional variability means generalizing about the entire continent risks missing important local patterns. The transition from Pleistocene to Holocene represents one of the most critical periods in Native American history. The foundations laid during this time of environmental upheaval shaped everything that followed. The diverse subsistence strategies that developed allowed humans to occupy every American ecosystem. The technological innovations that emerged provided tools for exploiting varied resources. The social adaptations that evolved enabled people to organize themselves in ways suited to different environments and resource bases. All later Native American cultures, from the complex chiefdoms of the Southeast to the agricultural civilizations of Mesoamerica, built on foundations established during this formative period. Yet this period remains poorly understood compared to later prehistory. Sites are relatively rare, often deeply buried under later deposits or destroyed by natural processes. Preservation of organic materials is typically poor, limiting what we can learn about diet and technology. The low population densities mean archaeological signatures are faint. Each new discovery adds important information, but gaps remain enormous. We understand the broad patterns but lack detailed knowledge of how specific groups adapted to specific challenges. Modern parallels are both illuminating and sobering. Early Americans faced rapid climate change, resource depletion, and ecosystem transformation. Their success in adapting demonstrates human capacity for resilience and innovation. They developed new technologies, exploited new resources, and reorganized their societies to meet changing circumstances. At the same time, their experience suggests limits. Some groups probably didn't survive. Populations declined in some regions. The stress of adaptation left marks in the archaeological record. Today, as we face our own period of rapid environmental change, the Ice Age experience of our ancestors offers both hope and warning. Humans can adapt to dramatic changes, but adaptation requires flexibility, innovation, and sometimes painful transformation. Living on the edge of extinction shaped Native American cultures in fundamental ways. The diversity of environments encountered as people spread across the continents, combined with the need to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, drove cultural diversification. The technological and social innovations developed during this period provided tools for dealing with uncertainty and change. The spiritual traditions that emerged helped people make sense of a world in flux. From this crucible of environmental challenge came the foundation for thousands of distinct Native American cultures, each adapted to its particular environment. Each carrying forward innovations developed when their ancestors lived on the edge and survived through ingenuity, cooperation, and determination. We began this journey standing in ancient Beringia, that frozen grassland connecting Asia and North America, watching mammoths move across an endless horizon. We ended with a completely transformed understanding of how humans reached the Americas and what that journey means for understanding our species. The simple story we once told of Clovis hunters crossing an ice-free corridor 13,000 years ago has given way to a far richer narrative. We now know that the first Americans diverged from Asian populations perhaps 36,000 years ago. They survived and adapted in Beringia, that harsh environment that served as both barrier and homeland. They expanded southward, probably following coastal routes along the Kelp Highway, exploiting rich marine ecosystems while exploring new territories. They reached South America by at least 14,500 years ago, possibly earlier. They brought diverse technologies and traditions. They encountered a world rich with megafauna that would largely disappear within a few thousand years. They adapted to dramatic climate changes, environmental transformations, and the challenges of populating two continents spanning from Arctic tundra to Amazonian rainforest. This wasn't a single moment, but a process unfolding over millennia. These weren't primitive peoples barely surviving, but sophisticated hunter-gatherers with complex technologies, detailed ecological knowledge, and the courage to venture into the unknown. Their success in populating and adapting to the Americas represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. The questions that open this episode: how did humans first reach the Americas, and when did they arrive? Have been answered, at least provisionally, via coastal and perhaps interior routes, using maritime technology and terrestrial hunting skills, beginning possibly as early as 20,000 years ago, but certainly by 16,000 years ago, expanding rapidly southward, and establishing populations that would diversify into the rich variety of Native American cultures. But answering these questions has revealed new mysteries. How many separate migration events occurred? What happened to early populations like those at Monte Verde? How did ancient peoples develop the maritime capabilities evident in the archaeological record? The story of how humans crossed from Asia to the Americas continues to unfold. Each discovery adds detail, sometimes confirms existing theories, sometimes demands revisions. What seemed impossible 30 years ago is now established fact. What seems impossible today may be tomorrow's discovery. The past is never truly past. It lives in our genes, our cultures, and our endless human curiosity about where we came from and how we became who we are. That journey from Beringia to the tip of South America wasn't just the peopling of continents. It was the beginning of American history, written in footsteps across a frozen landscape 13,000 years ago.